This week on the Lectures in History podcast, U.S. Army War College professor Michael Neiberg examines Vichy France, the collaborationist government that ruled the unoccupied part of France after its defeat in 1940, allied itself with Nazi Germany, and enforced harsh policies against its own people, including French Jews. He also looks at how those developments shaped the Anglo-American relationship during World War II. More after this.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron, and thanks everybody for coming here. Appreciate it. Today's Bastille Day, so no better day to be talking about French history. So when I first thought about doing this project, my original thought was to think about what the strategy of this strange, weird political thing called Vichy France was. So for those that don't know, this is what happens after the fall of France in 1940. The stuff that's basically in pink and red there are occupied directly by the Germans. The purple thing in the bottom is this strange political animal that becomes known as Vichy France, technically l'État français, the French state. It is supposed to be independent. It is supposed to be neutral in the World War. It maintained control over the French Navy, which was the second most powerful navy in Europe, and it retained control over the entire French Empire, which I'll show you in just a bit why that's so important. These people that ran the Vichy French government are really nasty people, really unpleasant people. They are pro-German. They are collaborationist. They are anti-British to their bones. They are anti-British, but they claim to be pro-American. And many of them, including the head of the French state, Henri-Philippe Petain, a general marshal in the First World War, had very good relations with American leaders. So I was kind of curious, what could possibly have been the theory of victory of this group of people that were simultaneously pro-German, pro-American, anti-British? How is that going to work? What do you think is going to happen when this is all over? So I went to France with an idea. I was going anyway with an idea towards kind of maybe thinking about this, looking to see if anybody else had thought about this. And I had a dinner with a French friend of mine who told me, look, don't do this. Vichy is still one of these things that's kind of right below the surface in France. And I think France has done a better job in the last few years, but it's true. This is still a living history, a living wound for a lot of French people. So I came back and I thought, all right, maybe I don't want to do this after all. But then I thought, well, we have the Army's archive, which Professor Blight referenced yesterday. And there I found an entire copy of the papers of the man that Roosevelt sent to be ambassador to Vichy France, an admiral named William Leahy. Now, we don't normally have Navy stuff where I work, but in 1961, President Kennedy sent a general, James Gavin, to be the ambassador to France. And Gavin asked for a complete copy of all of the correspondence, because he wanted to know what had happened under the Vichy years before he showed up in France. So I had a complete copy of everything. And this was around the time that things were starting to shut down, when it was, research I was going to have to do kind of closer to home. And a different picture started to emerge. A picture whereby it was the United States that needed a theory of victory. And now Vichy had a theory of victory, and I can explain it. It's a little bit nuts, but it had one. But it was the United States now that had to be worried about what was going to happen when Vichy fell and when France fell and what to do. And I want to explain a little bit of that. And I want to start by explaining a little bit of the panic that is in American leaders. So this is just an example. I don't want to read all these out to you. But you can see these are folks who are deeply, deeply worried that the fall of France is going to put the United States in an unbelievably exposed and dangerous strategic position. And again, I don't want to read them, but you can see what they're talking about here. They're terrified about this. And part of the reason is that all American defense planning had been based on the assumption that what happened in the Second World War would be what happened in the First World War, namely that France would hold off, some combination of France and Britain, would hold off the Germans just long enough to give the United States time to plan and enter the war at the time and place of our choosing. Without France in the war, that's simply not possible. And what you get coming out of this is almost a post-9/11 feeling, where all of the strategic assumptions they had are now just gone. They're just completely invalidated. And it's actually worse than that, because if you look at the map, can you advance 2 slides, please? One more, please. If you look at the map, the French Empire, which Vichy controlled, has a lot of points where it can impact what the United States wants to do. Everything with a French flag on there is the French Empire, circa 1940. These are my great PowerPoint skills you're seeing here. And the 5 that have stars around them are the ones that American military people were most concerned about. In the north, off the coast of Canada, are 2 islands, St. Pierre and Miquelon. They're not much, but they are Vichy French possessions. Most importantly to the Americans is the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. It's where France's gold supply is, and it's where France's aircraft carrier is. And you can see how close it sits to the Panama Canal. right? The United States had just assumed the Panama Canal would not be under any threat at all. Now it might be. Indochina, which sits near the American possession of the Philippines, and the two ports that jut out into the Atlantic Ocean, most importantly Dakar, Senegal, but also up in Morocco. Now the question is twofold. A, what will happen if any part of that, anything that has a French flag on it up there, if the French turn it over to the Germans? That's problem number one. And problem number two, what if Vichy France actively joins the war on their own accord for whatever reason? And they are threatening to enter the war against the British. Right? There are threats that they're going to do that. Now all of a sudden, this map, which American planners would have looked at and said, there's nothing to worry about here. All of those French flags are at least neutral, if not actively allied to us. Now you have to worry about what that's going to do. And it gets worse still. Could you do one more for me, please? Oh, try on the screen itself there. Try. Oh, can you go back one? There we go. Okay. Even worse. What happens if the French Navy gets turned over to the Germans? And as you can see, it's a powerful Navy. 5 battleships, 18 cruisers, that aircraft carrier, 58 destroyers, and 76 submarines. And those of you that know your World War II history will know that Winston Churchill decided to take care of this problem on his own by ordering the British Navy to attack the French fleet at a place called Mers el-Kabir, killing more Frenchmen up to that point in the war than the British had killed Germans. So you can guess what this did to Vichy's hatred of England, right? So now you've got to worry about all kinds of problems. You can see William Bullitt here, the American ambassador to France when France fell, telling FDR, you're not going to be able to protect us. If they get a hold of this fleet, we're done. So Vichy's now a very serious problem for American political thinkers. And it's also a problem because of the belief that France couldn't have fallen if not from treason from within. And as I was researching this book, I began to realize how Vichy was connected to so many other things in the Second World War. One of them is the first American admission by a public official that we knew that the Germans were massacring Jews in the East. That comes as a result of Vichy. I can explain the connection if you like. But also the decision to inter Japanese Americans. Because the assumption is France could never have fallen. A state this strong could never have fallen had there not been treason from within. Right? And the key thing that I love here is this film, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, which went nowhere when it was first released. Warner Brothers re-released it after the fall of France. It became a blockbuster and even got a letter from the United States government thanking Warner Brothers for bringing this critical issue to American ears. It's really, really interesting. And you can see here the concerns in the American media that what you have in France was this fifth column that brought the country down at the very moment when it should have been strong. So Vichy's connecting to all of these different things. And this is what I argue in the book. This is what really wakes the American people up and wakes the American government up. It is the fall of France that leads to everything that you see here. Okay? All of these things were being debated in the Congress. They were being talked about, but there was no action on any of them. All of a sudden, after the fall of France, we open up the budget and do anything you can dream of. A 2-Ocean Navy Act, the Selective Service Act, National Guard Act, 2 million man army. There was a proposal for a 4 million man army. And George Marshall said, no, I don't think we can sustain that right now. Probably could have gotten a 4 million man army after the fall of France if he'd asked for it. 36,000 airplanes, $12 billion committed to defense when the entire federal budget was $9 billion. It's because we're scared. We don't know what's going to happen next. And it's connected to the fall of France. There is also this secret order on wiretaps. There was a Supreme Court case that had just been heard that said that wiretaps were illegal. President Roosevelt told the Attorney General that case was about revenue fraud. This is about national security. Ignore the Supreme Court. If you need to do wiretaps for national security reasons, you do it. And also Roosevelt reshuffling his cabinet to put Republicans in as Secretary of War and Navy, respectively. This is a big deal. Imagine doing that now. Imagine a president picking 2 people from the other party to have 2 jobs that important. That's how scared people are. What Roosevelt's trying to do, in effect, is create a national unity government within the way that our system permits. Next, please. Oh, sorry, the Destroyer for Bases Agreement, which many of you know. Right? We give the Brits a bunch of old leaky destroyers. They give us access to bases in the Caribbean. Why do we want those bases? So we can keep an eye on that aircraft carrier in Martinique. That's the primary reason. Next slide, please. Thanks, Ron. Now, what to do about Vichy itself? Vichy is run by these 2 guys. Neither one of them is particularly popular in the United States, but Petain has some support. He was a good friend of John Pershing, who was still alive. A lot of Americans remembered him from the First World War as a solid leader of the French army, one of the real solid leaders of the French army. The guy on the left, however, the Prime Minister of France, nobody likes. This is Pierre Laval. I was just in Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes I go down there just sort of to make sure he's still underneath there. And you can see what one American observer described him as: a squatty, villainous-faced old man. Nevertheless, both of these guys say to any American that bothers to come to Vichy, we want American friendship. We hate the British. We kind of think the Germans are going to win the war. We want to be on their side. We like a lot of what they're doing. But we're your friend. We're going to make sure nothing bad happens. So you can see where there's some question about what the United States ought to be doing. And I can talk a little more about Laval and Petain. Petain, by this point, is older. He's falling asleep in meetings. What the Americans really want to know, one of the things the Americans really want to know, which of these two guys is actually running the French state. If Petain is really in control, then maybe we can work with him. If Laval's actually the guy that's in control, it's going to get a lot more complicated. It's going to be a lot more difficult to do. Thanks, Ron. Okay, the British took a very different approach than we took. The British right away said, Vichy's illegitimate. It has no support, no popular sovereignty, nothing that created it, except the act of the German occupiers. Therefore, it's illegitimate. We don't recognize its existence. And we are instead going to embrace the most junior general in the French army, who got on an airplane on June 18th, Waterloo Day, came to London, went to Carlton Gardens, broadcast on the BBC, in which he told the French people, I am taking on the mantle of France. The government in Vichy is illegitimate. It's actually a brilliant speech. Right? My American Army students sometimes don't like it, but I say it's the only person in 1940 who laid out the vision for the end of the war the way it actually happened. De Gaulle says France has lost a battle, but it hasn't lost a war, because this is a world war, and when it ends, France will be there with the victorious powers. We will be on the winning side. But for now, the government in Vichy is completely illegitimate, and we have to reject it. Now, the relationship between these two men is not necessarily very good. I'm a huge admirer of Charles de Gaulle, but I have a feeling I would have really hated to meet him. Right? I think de Gaulle understood what was happening in the world. What I mean by I'm a huge admirer is I think he understood what was happening better than anybody else in 1940, maybe all the way to 1944. He got it. He understood what was happening and how to place France in what was happening. He and Churchill did not necessarily get along, but Churchill made the decision that this is what we're going to do. We're going to back de Gaulle, even though de Gaulle also has no popular sovereignty or no backing. Okay? The US is going to take a different approach. Oh, sorry, skip that one. I'm going to come back to it later if you want, but let's skip that one. The US takes a different approach. Roosevelt sends one of his most trusted advisors, that Admiral Leahy that I mentioned, to go to Petain as US ambassador to Vichy France. The British cannot think, what the hell are you doing? You are going to take the prestige of the United States and you're going to attach it to this awful pro-German collaborationist regime. What is wrong with you? And Leahy gets to France. He has a French-speaking wife. He speaks some French. He shows up and he immediately begins to send reports back to Washington. Look, this place is a mess. Right? One report says it's a banana republic without the bananas. Like, it's not a government. It's not, it's just kind of foundering along, trying to figure out what to do. And Leahy keeps telling Roosevelt, I don't think I should stay here for much longer. And Roosevelt keeps saying to him, no, I need you to stay there. Right? The American view, the old American historiographic view, influenced by a guy named William Longer, who was involved in all this, was that the US kind of held its nose and did what it had to do in time of war. I argue in the book it's more than that. There were actually things about Vichy that the Americans liked. They liked that it was anti-communist. They liked that it promised to be pro-American. They liked that it was some form of stability in a very unstable European world. There were things about Vichy they were willing to take a chance on. And the British just can't understand it. And I talk in the book, this is the #1 source of tension between the US and Britain. Secretary of State Cordell Hull twice threatens to resign when he thinks that he's getting too much pressure on what to do about Vichy. Twice. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Can we go forward? Yep. America's relationship with Vichy is incredibly unpopular. It is not working. These are two cartoons from Dr. Seuss. The one has Laval and Benito Mussolini chasing war spoils. and Hitler is saying, "Come on, my faithful dogs, and you shall share equally." The one on the right, there was a moment when Petain found out that Laval was taking gold that was supposed to be stored, Belgian gold, that was supposed to be stored in France for safekeeping, and he was going to take it and give it to the French treasury. And Petain said, "That's it, that's not what we agreed to," and kicks him out of government. The Germans react by sending a squad of guys with machine guns to put Laval back in power. So that's what this is indicating. These are the Nazis bringing Laval, a stinking Laval, back to the front door, and the woman in the back is Marianne, the symbol of the French Republic. And he says, "Marianne, look what the cat brought back." Right? It's at this moment that the Americans realize, look, Vichy actually isn't in control of anything. The Germans actually are calling the shots. This isn't working. And the other one, Ron and I talked about this yesterday. Next slide, please. How many of you have seen the movie Casablanca? Please, lots of hands come up. Great. Okay, this movie's being made while all this is going on. Anybody remember the final scene? Louis picks up the bottle of water and dumps it in the trash. Take a look carefully at the bottle of water. It's a bottle of Vichy water. Right? They're not explicit about it in the movie, what he's doing, but every American who would have seen the movie would have understood what this is. Right? It's not just Humphrey Bogart and Claude Rains going off into the sunset to join a Free French unit. It is the rejection of Vichy and everything that it stands for. Right? The policy is extremely unpopular, yet the US government held on to it anyway. Next slide, please. Okay, so this becomes the debate. What do we want to do? Right? Churchill's great line here. The USA and Britain cannot each have a pet Frenchman. We've got to make a decision. What do you want to do? The Americans decided to back the guy on the left, Henri Giraud. I spelled wrong on the bottom. I apologize. It should be A-U-D. My fault. Giraud is, on paper, the guy you would want. He fought well in 1940. He escapes from this fortress in Saxony. I got to go this spring and stand where he rappelled down the mountain. Right? He avoids Gestapo assassins. I mean, it's a great story. And the Americans go, all right, maybe he can be our guy. We don't like de Gaulle, and we don't like Vichy. Maybe we'll pick this guy. Right? And as I talk about in the book, it very quickly becomes obvious that that man can wear a uniform really well, and that man can think about military operations, but not much more than that. De Gaulle is smarter than him, more devious than him, and easily starts to chisel him away bit by bit until the Americans are going to be left with nothing but de Gaulle. But there is a period where we're going to try something else. I could talk more about Giraud if anybody wants. I'm embarrassed as a Francophile for that mistake. Okay, the other guy involved in Vichy is the head of the Vichy armed forces, this man, Jean-François Darlan, described by one American intel official as, quote, "a short, bald-headed, pink-faced, needle-nosed, sharp-chinned little weasel." This is one of the guys we're putting our policy on. This is one of the guys we're counting on. He's one of the most anti-British officials in the Vichy state. He talks all the time about how happy he's going to be when the British have to come on their knees crawling at the next peace conference. He hates the British, especially after the British sunk his fleet at Mers el-Kabir, killing 1,300 of his sailors. He is today buried in the same cemetery as those sailors. And you can see, right, this policy is getting really unpopular. The great American journalist Edward R. Murrow, are we fighting the Nazis or are we sleeping with them? Like, what are we doing if we're dealing with these people? We need to do something else. We need to find another way out of this. This is not working. William Bullitt, it is as though Jesus had called upon Judas and said, "On this rock I found my church." Right? That's a great description of Darlan. Fabulous description of Darlan. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, can you back, please? There we go. Okay. So we got ahead a little bit with Darlan, but you all know the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, Operation Torch. The question is, what will the French forces, those are Vichy French forces in Morocco and Algeria, what will they do? Will they see the Americans as liberating North Africa, or will they think it's another Mers el-Kabir and shoot back? Everybody is hoping that the forces in North Africa will not shoot back, but it is widely believed they're going to shoot back. The other thing, of course, is that the military planners did not tell de Gaulle that they were going to do this. So as you can imagine, de Gaulle and Giraud both wake up furious when they find out that British and American forces are in North Africa without them being involved in the process. Right? De Gaulle at one point says, "Okay, if that's the way you want to do it, I hope the Vichy forces send you back into the sea." Right? Lord Allenbrook, the General Marshal equivalent in Great Britain, wrote to him, "I understand your bitterness, now overcome it." To de Gaulle's credit, he did. So the question becomes, once you've done this, this military invasion, and there's combat for about 48 hours until you can begin to get things calmed down, what is the long-term political solution going to look like in North Africa? The Americans and British do not want to stay in North Africa. They want to move on to Tunisia, which is also part of North Africa. They don't want to stay in Morocco and Algeria. They want to keep going. They want to defeat the Nazi forces and move on. So what are you going to do? Well, they get a little bit lucky in this case. Now let's go to Darlan. As it turns out, Jean-François Darlan is in Algiers, a place he really hated, because his son is there getting treatment for the exact same variant of polio that FDR has.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So the Americans get an idea. If we could get somebody to him, if we could have a conversation with him, maybe we could cut a deal. Maybe we could figure out a way to cut a deal. The Americans at first think maybe we could offer to send the son to Warm Springs, Georgia, where the president himself got treatment for polio. Instead, what the Americans come quickly to realize is the only thing the French care about, whether it's de Gaulle or Darlan or any other French official, what they care about is that France remains in control of North Africa when this is over. That the Americans don't hand North Africa over to the Algerians or the Moroccans. In other words, that we don't apply the Atlantic Charter in North Africa. That's all they care about, no matter who it is. It could be de Gaulle, it doesn't matter. Next slide, please. So, that's General Mark Clark. Clark cuts a deal. Clark goes to Darlan and cuts him a deal. If you order Vichy French forces to stop shooting at us, and you assist us as we move east to kill Nazis, we'll give you back North Africa. We won't interfere at all. Anything domestic, that's you. That's you. This deal is incredibly, astonishingly unpopular in the United States. Okay, this is where, next slide. Oh, please note, that's Petain's picture looking over Clark's shoulder, right? So the United States hasn't yet given up on the idea of cutting a deal with Petain too, right? Which is why de Gaulle is so suspicious of what the Americans are up to. Okay, now you get to the cool part. Now you get to the cool part. The United States seems stuck with Darlan. We're going to have to deal with this guy who a lot of Americans think is not that much better than a Goebbels or a Himmler or maybe even Hitler himself. On Christmas Eve 1942, we get a break. As he's walking into his office in the Summer Palace in Algiers, a young French resistance assassin kills him. And you can see the global reaction. I have not felt so relieved by any event for years, said the British Foreign Secretary. Mark Clark, it was like the lancing of a troublesome boil. And in the worst sports mix metaphor of World War II, Clark nevertheless said, once we got him in the box for our side, he pitched big league ball. In other words, once we got him to do what we wanted him to do, we could make a lot of use out of him. So this ends at least this element of the experiment that we had. Do I have one more slide, please, Ron? Or am I done there? I think we might be done. Nope. Go back one, please. Okay. I'll get to that one in a bit. Now the United States has to make another decision. Now that Darlan is gone, now what do you do? And again, there is this rivalry between Giraud and de Gaulle that, again, de Gaulle is slowly but surely winning. Right? De Gaulle gives Franklin Roosevelt a model of that battleship that I showed you, the Jean Bart, that the Americans had rebuilt for him, for the French. And he gives Roosevelt a model of the ship to say thank you. And Roosevelt's talking to Eleanor Roosevelt, and he says, I'm just going to give this thing to the kids. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, you can't do that. A head of state gave that to you. And Roosevelt says, he's not the head of a state. He's just the head of some committee. He's nothing until the French people vote him in. So de Gaulle creates this thing called the Provisional Government of the Republic of France and starts little by little to assume the instruments of government. And right before D-Day, he just drops the word provisional. The Republic of France. Okay. And it's, again, the way the story ends is de Gaulle ends up after D-Day. He's supposed to go in, get his picture taken, get a couple of newsreels shot, and go home. And that's not what he does. He goes to the beautiful medieval French town of Bayeux, and he gives a speech in which he says, the French government is back. I'm the head of it, and I'm standing on the first liberated piece of the new French Republic. And he begins the process of getting all the Vichy officials out of their jobs and putting his people in. Right? They vastly underestimated de Gaulle. And this is just the last thing. Just to note, I mean, I think I counted, it's in the introduction of the book, the number of heads of government, heads of state, general officers, diplomats who were part of all of this. And here are 3 of them when they were all prime ministers or presidents later on. De Gaulle, Eisenhower, and the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan were all part of this drama. They all remembered it. De Gaulle came here to Gettysburg to talk to Dwight Eisenhower after Eisenhower's retirement. I don't know if they talked about this period at all, because it was still a very touchy and unpleasant thing to talk about. But it sets all of their careers in a certain way on a certain path. So what I was interested in the book is kind of how the United States dealt with this problem. And again, coming back to the point about the theory of victory, the Vichy people really did believe, this is before the invasion of the Soviet Union, before Pearl Harbor, they really did believe what was going to happen is there would be a stalemate between Germany, the continent's great land power, and Britain, the continent's great sea power. And when they got back to a Treaty of Versailles Part 2, France would be able to play this balancing role and get back the northern part. Maybe lose Alsace and Lorraine, but they would get back the northern part. Right? They might have to give up Morocco, but they'd keep the rest of the empire. They had this whole strategy laid out. Right? And to me, it looks insane that they thought they were going to get away with this. But until all of this starts to break down, it's not clear exactly how this is going to go. And I want to underscore, and then I'll be happy to take some questions, because I think we're supposed to stop it about now, right? I also want to articulate this is not a very nice moment in American history. And as I talk about in the book, the reason I think no one has written about this before is because it runs so very counter to what we want to tell ourselves about the Second World War. Right? In this case, we were not on the side of the angels. We cut some deals with some pretty unpleasant people for some pretty unpleasant reasons. The fact that it didn't blow up in our face even worse than it did is almost partly by luck. And again, the last point, it is because of our relationship with Vichy that the Secretary of State is asked about Vichy's complicity in rounding up Jews and sending them to the East. And it's at that moment that Cordell Hull admits that yes, Vichy's doing it, and yes, we know that ultimately they're not going east to be resettled, they're going to death camps. And it's the first public admission of an American official that we knew that the ultimate goal of Germany was not resettlement, but genocide. So to me, Vichy is this kind of hub almost around which all of these things from World War II can be studied. So thanks, and I'll take any questions that you might have. I thought you were getting up to leave. You were going to the microphone.
I was told to do.
Yeah.
As we're a room of teachers, I love asking the question. We have very limited amounts of time with our students, and especially considering how much is there with World War II, whether it's world history or American history. What from this story do you think is important to pass along to our students, knowing that we have limited time with them?
I think maybe just how much uncertainty there actually was. That it's not like World War II began and everybody immediately knew what you were supposed to do. Like I sometimes do you hear this in the media sometimes, where people will say, well, why can't we just do it the way we did it in World War II? Because there's this image in our culture, this memory in our culture, that we did everything right. And this is a case where we clearly did something wrong and had to recover from it. So I think if I were to stress one thing, I think it would be that these big geopolitical problems that they were dealing with then and we're dealing with now have no easy answers, and you're going to make missteps and mistakes. How's that for an answer? I don't have a better one.
Yes, and a quick question. So, how do the French people teach that you went there to study the subject? How do
Turn it on. Turn on your microphone.
So, question would be, for the French people, how do they casually, socially excuse Nazi collaborators that weren't in the Vichy area versus the Vichy collaborators that have this stigma?
Yep.
Even though, like you said, they're more trying to just keep the French Empire in a survival mode.
Yeah, there's a lot of French people that I think used to argue that you can't really blame France. They were only doing it because the German occupiers were there. An American historian named Robert Paxton blew that out of the water with an excellent book that showed that the Vichy state did things well in advance of the Germans asking them to do it. That much of the anti-Semitism, much of what the Vichy state did was because of indigenous French political attitudes. What you're starting to see in the last 15, 20 years, first started in Paris and now it's starting to go through the rest of the country, is an admission that Vichy was deeply complicit. And what I love to do when I take people to Paris and walk them around, there are normally in Paris and other parts of France, there will be plaques that will say, this building had 250 Jews deported to Auschwitz. The old school plaques will say something like passive voice, like from this building, 250 Jews were deported. The newer ones will say the Vichy state working with the Germans, not the Germans pushing Vichy. It'll start with the Vichy state working with the Germans deported 250 children from here. So there is an awareness. There's been a recent Netflix, I think it's a Netflix France series called The Village that deals with a lot of these tensions. And there's been a real attempt in France, I think, to really start to dive a little bit deeper. A good friend of my cousin was actually involved in a podcast on the complicity of the French railway service, the SNCF, and all of the things that they were guilty of. So I think there has been an attempt in France to go back and reinvestigate this. There's also been a backlash. There was, in the last presidential election, there was a guy named Éric Zemmour who came out and tried to justify Vichy and tried to say, Vichy, the old argument that Vichy protected France from the worst of the Germans. Unfortunately, he was using it also to make an argument that France has the right to kick out Muslims from its country. So he's kind of on the nut edge, which I think that was the takeaway, that it wasn't mainstream anymore to praise Vichy. It had now moved to this kind of fringe right. So I think they're doing a much better job of it, but it is different if you're in the big city than if you are out in the French countryside. No, go ahead.
All right. This question actually might piggyback off of what was just asked. I think most of us are probably familiar with how the French reacted to the invasion of Normandy. The French people, although if you ask Saint-Lô, the people weren't super thrilled about it. How did the Vichy respond to, one, the people being set up as a puppet government, and then two, Operation Dragoon and the liberation of southern France?
Yeah, so Vichy's popularity begins a downturn when Vichy institutes this thing called the STO, which is a mandatory labor draft for the Germans. So once they do that, it's hard for Vichy to say, we're protecting you from Germany. Now they're actively complicit in rounding up young French men and sending them to German factories. So the Vichy state begins a clear decline in its popularity. As soon as Operation Torch happens, the Vichy state tries to hold on to some level of authority. Can you go back to the map, the very first map, please? The very first slide, if you can, Ron. What the Vichy state tries to do is say, look, nothing that's happening in the invasion of North Africa changes our authority in the southern part of the country. What happens, and Darlan is waiting for it to happen, the second the Germans cross what's called the demarcation line, the border between the two, the authority of Vichy completely goes away. Vichy's over. The Germans occupy that demarcation line, that dotted line that you see. As soon as the invasion of North Africa happens, and it's obvious that the Vichy forces are not going to fight to the death, the Germans take over the entire country. At that point, Vichy ceases to exist. Now, Laval and Petain are still alive, and there are still people in the United States who are saying, at the end of the war, those are the guys we ought to cut the deal with. And that's what de Gaulle is so terrified of. That and the Americans had a plan for the military occupation of all of France. This thing called AMGOT. They even had script printed out, the whole bit. And de Gaulle's like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So I don't know if that answers your question, but okay.
Thank you.
So why did President Roosevelt choose Admiral Leahy? And did he have concrete goals for him, or was it a fact-finding kind of ambassadorship?
Yeah, I think he chose Leahy for two reasons. A, he trusted him. And B, he was a military guy. He was an admiral. So he thought that Leahy would be able to talk to Petain and he would be able to talk to Darlan, because again, the fleet is the issue here. Leahy's wife spoke French, which is a not insignificant thing in diplomatic circles to be able to send that message. And I think he thought that Leahy would be the guy to A, keep the French fleet away from the Germans, and B, give a really good military assessment of what's going on. So Darlan's argument to the Americans is, and it's true, Darlan signed an order that said if anybody who is not French attempts to command a French ship, you are to scuttle the entire fleet. And he actually says, this stands even if I countermand it with my own signature. In other words, if the Germans put a gun to my head and make me countermand it, ignore it. And that's what happens. So when the Germans come down, they go to Toulon, which is where the Vichy fleet in Europe is. And the Germans try to take over those ships. And Vichy executes that order. They scuttle the entire Toulon fleet. So what Darlan is trying to convince the Americans of is you have nothing to worry about. If the Germans try to take it over, the ships will get scuttled. And Leahy's there to kind of say, all right, can I trust that? What's really going on? And the Americans, it's really kind of comical. The Americans try to set up an intel network in North Africa. And one of the things that this guy, Wild Bill Donovan, that some of you may have heard of, is one of my favorite moments as a scholar. The papers in Carlisle, Donovan's talking about all these intel operations that he's doing as he's going through Europe, and he's sure that the Germans have no idea what he's doing. Then when I got to Paris and I saw the Vichy files, the intel files still exist. Vichy burned a lot of stuff, but those files were still there. And I'm like, yep, Donovan's in Sofia. We know all about it. We went through his suitcase. Like, we got it. We understand exactly what he's doing. So it was really great to kind of see the other side of that. But the intel network we set up is childish at best. Right? One guy's a perfume salesman. One guy, I think, had the Coca-Cola franchise for North Africa, and they really have no idea what they're doing. So, yes, sir.
Michael, thanks for a fantastic talk. I found myself envious. You could cover so much so quickly. What about the resistance? What can you tell us? Did the resistance really begin in the south? I know it was really strong around Lyon eventually. It begins when Vichy is still Vichy. It has to fight the Germans and Vichy. What can you tell us about how the French resistance evolved in this chaotic situation?
Yeah, great question. So Lyon is the key because it is in the unoccupied sector, and it's a big enough city that the resistance can sort of organize. And there's a museum there in the place where they murdered Jean Moulin, one of the great French resistance heroes. The Americans are really suspicious of the French resistance. A, because they're not sure it can actually do anything, and B, because most of it is dominated by communists and socialists. And they don't want to liberate France and then see it turn. They don't want de Gaulle to turn into Kerensky. In other words, they don't want to create this kind of provisional government that the communists then edge out. They don't want to do that. So we are really, really suspicious of helping out the French resistance. This is a question in France. It's one of those questions where if I know how somebody thinks historically, I can pretty much guess their politics. So if somebody tells you the resistance was absolutely critical, without the resistance, nothing good would have happened, they're left of the French government, right? They're left of the French political system. Because they need this idea that we kind of liberated ourselves. And it's the justification for the Communist Party and Socialist Party in the post-war period that we fought the Nazis while the right collaborated with them. The industrialists and the bourgeois, they collaborated. The Americans are really, really nervous about this. They are worried that de Gaulle is going to get played by these resistance guys, and or they're worried that de Gaulle is going to cut a deal with them, which in fact he does. So de Gaulle tells the resistance guys, this fantastically interesting guy named Henri Rouletanguy, who leads the French uprising in Paris, leads the resistance in Paris, and he cuts them a deal. If your guys will join the French army as a regular battalion under the authorities, I'll guarantee free and fair elections. And whatever you guys win, you got it. And that's what they do until the Americans with the Marshall Plan come in and go, yeah, no communists in the game. No. But de Gaulle sticks to that deal. So I would argue that the resistance is really important in specific areas where they can coordinate with the advancing armies. But I would, this is being videotaped, so I don't know what my French friends are going to say. I would say it was mission helpful, not mission essential or critical. Right? What's really important is the Germans want to get out of Paris with as many of their guys alive as possible so they can fight on the West Wall on the Rhine River. That's what's really doing it. Right? Any other questions? One in the back, yes. Use the mic. Use the mic.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So just as you were talking about the Allies rolling back the Germans after D-Day, I was thinking about those images of French women who had relationships with Germans being chased down the street, their hair cut off. Yeah. Sort of the French 20th century version of tarring and feathering. Yeah. Beyond that immediate recrimination, how would you assess the French reconstruction between those who collaborated and those who, how did they do with that process?
This is one of de Gaulle's great, like what I argued in another book, a book I wrote on the liberation of Paris. De Gaulle had very little to do with the liberation of Paris, but he played his political cards perfectly. What he does is come in and say, if I am the French state, and if we're reestablishing the French state, all this extra legal stuff has to stop. All punishment, all judicial, everything like that has got to go through the French state. So what that does is it tells your average middle-class French person, okay, at least this guy's going to stop the retribution killings that you were seeing in France and Italy and other places. So de Gaulle comes back in and says, no, we're going to do this by a legal authority. And they end up doing something not too dissimilar with what we did in Germany. They pick out the very worst of the worst, right? Laval gets executed. Petain got a death sentence, but he was so old and senile that they let him live his life on an island off of southwest France. And then the rest, de Gaulle says, we were all resistors in our heart. Because he was trying to close that page and get the country back moving again. But he created this order of the resistance. If you go to the Les Invalides, the French Military Museum, there's this beautiful marble thing with the names of all of those guys on there, men and women on there. But he tried not to do this deep, the French word would be épuration. He tried to avoid this deep purging, I guess would be the English equivalent, of French society, because he knew he had to get the society moving again. Yeah, I think it was successful in a similar way to what you saw in Germany, where you could say, well, it was just like 15 of those guys that did this, and the rest of us were just doing what we had to do because we were kind of forced to do, even if it was people like Coco Chanel who were living at the Ritz with a German officer, right? Then you could kind of turn around and move forward. I just heard a really interesting paper that argued that the reason the Germans have been so willing to accept collective guilt is because they're unwilling to face individual guilt. That is, the society did bad things, but not my Opa. And I think you see something similar to that. Or in France, what they'll say is, look, these 98% of these decisions were really gray. They weren't black and white. So you can't really go after somebody for a decision that was clearly gray. So in the instance you talked about, the women with shaved heads, there was a kind of moral economy that went on. Like if you dealt with the Germans to feed your family, you probably escaped that. But if you lived better than everybody else by sleeping with the German officer, then you were at a greater risk. So there was a kind of way in which they were saying, look, we all understand in tough times people do what they have to do. You went too far. Any other last questions? Or yeah, please. Yeah, good. Cardinals fan. That's all right. I'll take a question from a Cardinals fan. It's all right. It's all right. It's all right.
It's all right. We can't all be winners like the Cardinals, I guess. My question is, as you said, that America learned from the Vichy government what was happening to the Jewish population and so forth. Like, how do we, as a nation, as a civilization, really, an American society, how do we reconcile with that and kind of our role in the bigger picture of the Holocaust like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question that I can't answer in just a couple of minutes. But I mean, I think, I talk to audiences about this all the time. The United States, contrary to how we remember it, did not get involved in this war to rescue the Jews of Europe. That is not what the plan was. And even when there were opportunities to do things like bomb the camps at Auschwitz, the answer, and it's maybe a not unreasonable answer, but the answer was, we know we're going to win the war. And once we win the war, the killing stops. Even then, however, once the killing stops and there's hundreds of thousands of Jews sitting in camps at the end of the war, the U.S. still refused to open up its borders. And American support for the creation of the State of Israel is in large part dictated by the reality that if we send them to Israel, there will be no pressure to let them in here. So it's not a good news story. And again, I think what we have to do, at your level it may be a little bit harder, but what I feel I have to do as an historian is make sure that everybody understands that there is gray in the Second World War story that Americans would like to tell in black and white. But there's an awful lot of gray in there. Vichy's part of it, and America's reaction to the Holocaust is another part of it. Thanks. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody. Let's hope the AC's fixed.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.